Welcome back to LexTalks, Legal Topics Simplified. It's great to have you back with us as we dive into the fascinating world of law, especially for all you law students out there in India. Today, we're going deep on a concept that's really key to understanding how Indian federalism works. It's the Doctrine of Territorial Nexus. We've got legal texts, articles, even some sneak peeks at potential exam questions all lined up to help us really get a grasp on this.
You know what I find so fascinating about this doctrine is that it's not just some, abstract legal theory. It's a living, breathing concept. It's shaping how laws are made and applied like every single day here in India.
Absolutely. It's like the rule book for how the central government and those state governments share power, making sure, everyone stays in their lane. So let's start with the basics. What exactly is this Doctrine of Territorial Nexus? I mean, we can't have states making laws about things happening all the way on the other side of the country, can we?
Exactly. Can you imagine if every state could just pass laws affecting everything and anything, regardless of where it was happening? It'd be utter chaos. That's where this doctrine of territorial nexus steps in. It's like setting up these clear boundaries, ensuring that states can only make laws about things that have like a genuine connection to their territory. And that's where Article 245 of the Indian Constitution comes in. It very clearly states that a state's lawmaking power, it's got to be limited to things within its own territory.
Okay, so it's like this invisible fence keeping those legislative powers, in check. But isn't that kind of limiting for states?
Yeah.
What if something's happening outside their borders, but they really need to address it?
That's where it gets really interesting. You see, it's not just about like physical location. It's more about impact and connection. Remember that case, State of Bombay versus RMD Chamar Bagwala. That one really shows how this doctrine plays out, in the real world.
Yeah, the crossword puzzle one.
Yeah.
Right? I remember reading about that. Seems kind of silly on the surface, but I bet it had some serious legal implications.
Absolutely. So it was about this newspaper published in Bangalore. They ran a prize competition. Seemed pretty straightforward, right? But here's the quiz. This newspaper, super popular in Bombay. Tons of people there were participating in this competition, sending in their entry fees.
Ah, so even though the newspaper itself was outside of Bombay, all that money and participation was coming from within the state. So that
Yep.
creates a connection then, right?
Exactly. The Bombay government, they wanted to tax that revenue from those entry fees. And the newspaper, well, they argued, hey, we're not based in Bombay, you got no jurisdiction over us. But the Supreme Court, they sided with the Bombay government. They said there was a clear territorial nexus because even though that prize competition was organized outside Bombay, it had this direct financial impact within the state. And that's what gave them the power to tax it.
That's a really good example. So it's not just about where something's physically happening. It's also about those effects, those connections that stretch beyond the state borders. This case has got to be like a landmark case for law students in India. I mean, it really shows how broadly this doctrine can be applied. It's not just about geography. It's about that demonstrable link.
Precisely. And what's even more interesting is that this principle, it's not unique to India. Lots of federal systems around the world, they've got similar doctrines to try and balance out the power between their central governments and, their regional governments. Like even the United States, they have something called the Commerce Clause, which deals with similar issues like interstate trade and regulation and all that.
So there's like a global dimension to this concept as
Yeah.
well. That's pretty fascinating. It really shows you how these seemingly abstract legal principles, they have, these real world implications, not just in India, but on this much wider scale.
Absolutely. And for law students in India, understanding the nuances of this doctrine of territorial nexus, crucial. It pops up in so many areas of law, from taxation and commerce to like criminal jurisdiction and environmental regulations.
All right, so before we jump into some more specific examples, let's just kind of recap what we've talked about so far. The Doctrine of Territorial Nexus. It's like this legal guardrail, keeps the powers of the central and state government in check. And remember, it's not just about location, location, location. It's about that impact, the connections, the things that can stretch beyond just a state's physical boundaries. We saw that in that Chamar Bagwala case. The impact of that prize competition gave the Bombay government that right to tax, even though that newspaper was based in a whole other state.
Okay, so we've got a pretty good handle on this whole, doctrine of territorial nexus thing, but let's see how it actually plays out, like
Yeah.
in the real world, in scenarios that you as law students and future lawyers might actually encounter.
You're like, let's put all this knowledge to the test. I mean, it's one thing to get the theory, but what about those situations where it's not so obvious if there's a territorial nexus? Those are the ones that can really trip you up on an exam or even, in a real case.
Absolutely. So let's say we have this company, right, officially registered in state A, but get this, they operate this crazy popular e-commerce website selling goods all over India. Their main servers, their headquarters, they're all in state B, but they're making a killing from all these customers in state C. Now, state C, they want a piece of that pie. They want to impose a tax on all the company's online sales happening within their territory. But the company's pushing back. They're saying, hey, hold on. We don't even have a physical store in state C, so how can you tax us? What do you think?
That's a tough one. Sounds like a classic law school exam question. It brings up so many of the things we've been talking about. Online business transactions happening across different states.
Yeah.
And that big question, where does that territorial nexus really lie?
Exactly. And to really break this down, we got to look at the specifics. That fact that they're registered in state A, important, but it's not the whole story. Same thing with their servers and headquarters in state B. The real kicker, significant sales revenue from state C. That phrase right there, that's the key.
Ah, I see what you're getting at. So even though they don't have like a physical presence in state C, the fact that they're making all that money from customers there, that's what establishes that connection, kind of like a Chamar Bagwala case, right? The impact is what really matters.
Bingo. Their registration, their physical stuff, all relevant, but it's that direct financial impact on state C. That's what creates that strong argument for territorial nexus. It's like this virtual flow of money connecting their business activities to that specific state. And that gives state C a legit claim to tax those online sales.
This is so interesting because it really shows how the doctrine of territorial nexus isn't just some static, outdated principle.
Yeah.
It's dynamic. It adapts to the changing world, especially with things like e-commerce and online businesses blurring all those traditional geographical boundaries. It's like the legal system is finally catching up to the digital age.
Exactly. This is what makes studying law so fascinating. It's not about just, memorizing a bunch of stuff. It's about understanding these core principles and applying them to these new situations using legal reasoning to solve problems that didn't even exist a few decades ago.
And for all our listeners out there who are law students in India, I think this is after a big takeaway here. It's not enough to just know what the doctrine of territorial nexus is. You got to understand how it works in practice, how it's been interpreted in those key cases, and how it applies to all these emerging areas like e-commerce. That's what's going to set you apart both in your exams and later on in your legal careers.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's about seeing the law as this living, breathing thing, evolving right alongside society. Now, before we wrap up our deep dive here, let's just shift gears for a sec. I want to touch on something that I find incredibly fascinating. We've been talking about this doctrine of territorial nexus in India today, but this whole idea of balancing power between, different levels of government that exists in so many countries around the world, each one has its own way of tackling it. And it's amazing to see, the similarities and the differences in how these principles play out.
Oh, that's a great point. It reminds me of that saying, the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Yeah.
We might be talking about legal systems in different countries,
Right.
but that core challenge is the same, how to divide power effectively and fairly.
Exactly. So here's a final thought I want to leave our listeners with. How do other federal countries, like, say, the United States or Canada, how do they handle this balance of power between that central government and their regions? Do they have something similar to this doctrine of territorial nexus?
Yeah.
How are they similar? How are they different? I think, exploring these questions, it's a fantastic way to really deepen your understanding of comparative constitutional law and the global implications of these legal principles.
That's a really great question to leave our listeners with. I mean, I'm already thinking about all the research I could do. It's amazing how, exploring just one legal concept in India can open up this whole world of, comparative legal studies.
It really does. I mean, it really highlights how interconnected legal systems are all over the globe. I always love seeing how different countries approach these similar challenges,
Yeah, and I think that's a perfect place to wrap up our deep dive into this doctrine of territorial nexus. We've covered so much ground today from, its roots in the Constitution to those real-world applications in cases like Chamar Bagwala and even, how it's evolving to deal with the whole digital age.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure unpacking this whole doctrine with you and with our listeners.
Right.
Hopefully we've shed some light on this, fundamental principle of Indian federalism and maybe even sparked some curiosity about how similar concepts play out in other legal systems, all around the world.
For sure. I mean, we've seen how this doctrine of territorial nexus, it's like this legal compass. It guides that whole division of powers between the central government and the states, ensuring a balance that's just so essential for, a functioning federal system.
And for our listeners out there, those law students in India, remember, this isn't just about, acing those exams. This is about truly understanding the principles that are like the foundation of our legal system and, how they shape our society. These are the concepts that will stay with you throughout your entire legal careers.
So true. So as you continue your studies, keep asking those questions. Don't just, take things at face value, dig a little deeper, explore those different perspectives, and always be on the lookout for those aha moments that really deepen your understanding. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and who knows, maybe one of you listening right now will be the next legal scholar to write that groundbreaking paper on, the global implications of territorial nexus.
Now, that's a challenge I bet some of our listeners are ready to take on. Thanks for listening to Lex Talks. Follow, subscribe, and stay notified so you never miss an episode.